Welcome to the School Psychology Review Zoom webinar focused on school climate, bullying, and social emotional learning, a transdisciplinary and transnational science advancing positive youth outcomes emphasis in our discussion here today. And we're very fortunate, I feel extremely fortunate to be here with Dr. Tamika Salle, Dr. Chunyan. Dr. Dorothy Espelage is unable to because she's tied up presently in congressional hearings where she's providing information about these important topics. And then myself, Shane Jimerson. We'll do introductions in just a moment. But as folks are joining us this morning, just wanted to highlight that for those that out there who are active on social media, we welcome your engagement on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, as well as the SPR YouTube channel. This recording, of course, will be featured on the SPR YouTube channel. And you're welcome to take screenshots during the session today to post those on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, wherever you're active on social media. And we do encourage you to follow us and engage with us and be active. In addition to this session here today, lots of great information and articles that we feature on the social media website. So also wanted to highlight who's participating. There's a brief poll that's up there presently, and I'll just summarize it real quick. There's about 25% of the participants who are students, about 33% who are practitioners, and then about another 30% who are faculty members, about 8% who are administrators, and about 5% who are other. In terms of what is your primary field of focus, school psychology is reported from 95% of the participants here so far today. And then also child development, 5%, and education, 3%. Regarding the question, have you previously submitted an article to a journal for review? Of those participants, 38% have indicated yes, and 63% indicated not yet. So hopefully this information today will be helpful in providing some helpful information about how to go about preparing a submission for this special topic section. And the final question was, have you previously submitted an article to School Psychology Review for consideration for publication? And again, 28% said yes, again, specifically submitting to School Psych Review. So 73% not yet. And hopefully the information that's shared here today will help some of you who might consider School Psychology Review as an outlet for your scholarship, as it has very wide distribution in the partnership with Taylor and Francis to disseminate the journal, as well as going out to over 25,000 school psychologists, practitioners. So it's a tremendous opportunity to bring science to practice, which is really our focus here today in this SPR Zoom webinar, is to be able to share information, provide insights, updates, and also provide a bit of perspective on the topics and information about how to submit to the special topics section as well. Okay, so without further ado, we'll go ahead and highlight that the call has been out for several months, and you can find this located on the NASP School Psych Review website here. You can see that submissions are due July 20th. We'll mention that several times for this particular special topic section. And you can find this information again on the NASP website, and you can download a flyer that looks like what's on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, featuring the core information about the special topic section. And for those of you who have great scholarship in this area, but it's not yet going to be ready or prepared for July 20th, we do welcome further submissions on these topics beyond that time. It just might be that it would not be able to be featured or reviewed for consideration in the particular special topic section that will be forthcoming. But we do always welcome your submissions on these important topics. Okay, and we'll do a brief introduction, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. LaSalle to share a little bit of information about her journey and her expertise, and then we'll go down the list here. So,
hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Tamiko Sam. I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut in the school psychology program. And I'll just talk briefly about my research and kind of how I got to where I am today with respect to the work that I'm focused on. So I focused a lot early on scale development relative to school climate. When I was in grad school in around 2012, they passed the No Child Left Behind waiver. And with that waiver, states were able to include non-academic indicators for their annual reports. And so I was in Georgia at that time, and they were using a brief school climate survey, and they wanted to create a school climate star rating. And so part of the work started around our interest in how do students experience school, and recognizing that if we're going to hold schools accountable relative to school climate, we need to make sure that it's a valid and reliable measure. And so we spent several years validating a school climate survey, but I'll talk a little bit more about the many options that are out there relative to school climate work. But I became really interested in, again, understanding student experiences and how they are different across different student groups, especially when you think about different cultural variables, race and ethnicity, students with disabilities, even geography, students who grow up in cities versus suburbs versus rural settings. What are the differences in their experiences, and how their individual and collective experiences can be shaped. So again, a lot of my research was around developing scales. I helped to develop the Georgia School Climate Survey, which is used across the state of Georgia annually. And we have adopted it through PBIS and use that also. And so that's been one of the big areas of focus. I also look a lot at the experiences of minoritized and marginalized groups. And so specifically, we've looked at the experiences of minoritized students, the experiences of students with disability, the experience of students with who identify as LGBTQ+. And the purpose of my work there is to be able to use that information to guide targeted supports for students in schools. And so not using this one size fits all approach, I really focus on disaggregating data and not just looking at it overall. So if I look at overall school climate, they might have a really positive school climate and think, okay, we're doing fine. But I think it's important to dig into the data and to look at how certain groups are performing or perceiving the school, and how that intersects with how they're performing, with discipline, with attendance, with all of these other outcome measures. I also engage in international research. So I run or lead an international collaborative where we collected data from 12 other countries. We went through this process of translating, back translating, making sure that there's this the cultural iteration of these school climate questions. And we completed a validation study, and we looked at mental health across these 12 different countries. And so that's part of the focus on transnational research, is understanding that school climate is this, I think that it's conceptually, school climate matters everywhere, but different aspects of school climate depending on where you're at. And then my most recent research, my current research right now, is focused on looking at the experiences of Black and Latinx students. And so we're collecting data through surveys. And then in the summer, we will be doing follow-up semi-structured interviews. And so we're adding additional component to the research. And the purpose of that is to look at what aspects through the quantitative data help us to identify what pieces or aspects of the school environment have an impact on student outcomes. And then the follow-up is to get more information about what that looks like. So if students say adults are really important to school climate, then which adults are you going to? What services are they providing to you? And so that's where the interview component comes in, so that we can be much more descriptive about what those factors are. And I'll talk about the factors of school climate, but what those factors are and how they work differently across specific groups. So that's pretty much where what I'm doing now.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. LaSalle. And Dr. Yang, how about you provide a bit of background and information?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chunyan, and I'm assistant professor in the graduate school education at UC Berkeley. So my research interest is focused on how school members, students, parents, and teachers, how they interact with very diverse social contexts to find the resilience when they are facing a variety of risk factors. And the main risk factors that my research have been focused on, including bullying, victimization, and more recently, teacher-targeted violence. And we also recently looking at some of the COVID-related risk factors in a school context. And those risk factors are important to study because they are chronic and intersectional issues related to school safety, teacher retention, and mental health prevention intervention in the US context and also many other countries across the world. So in my work, I have very similar career trajectory as Dr. LaSalle, that started working as a graduate student, contribute to some of the development of Delaware School Climate Survey, which is a school-wide system, survey system looking at student, teacher, parents' perceptions of school climate and school discipline practice, bullying, victimization, social emotional learning, and student engagement. So this survey, similar to Georgia, that has been administered more than 100, but much less. Delaware is a much smaller state, but it does provide a very unique context to understand the school-wide and also statewide phenomenon of school climate, looking at how we use those information to support the implementation of school-wide PBS as well as bullying prevention. So I started working with the measurement piece, looking at school climate, but also started very interesting understanding how school climate context and interact with students' social emotional competencies. And in my work, I conceptualize those two as the most important dimensions of the school-wide SEL, looking at both the contextual positive climate as well as instructional support of how we help students develop competency in the social emotional domain. So I'm interested in understanding how these two concepts or construct as an overall concept of school-wide SEL to contribute to the antecedents and also consequences of bullying victimization. And so beyond the work in the US context, I grew up in China and also trained as a science teacher in China. So I'm also interested into looking at the role of cultural and educational system, the cultural variations of school climate perception, as well as the influences to student bullying experiences and their engagement in different educational contexts. So we're looking at how students and parents' perceptions of school climate varied across different cultural linguistic populations, and looking at the connections, trying to understanding some of the similarities as well as differences of those cultural variation. And more recently, I've been started looking at beyond the student populations. I'm also looking at how school climate and SEL competency, they'll contribute to teachers' experiences in the school violence dynamics, looking at teacher-targeted violence. That is one of the more recent work. So I think this special topic really looking us into transactional relationship between school climate and bullying victimization, bullying as well as SEL really help us to understand this social school ecological system better. So I'm looking forward to more conversation on this topic today.
Thank you, Dr. Young. And I just want to highlight that the work that Dr. LaSalle and Dr. Young have been doing is just so incredibly important, great scholarship, and they've been working on it for years here, but both are very much early career colleagues and scholars who are excelling and making tremendous contributions. And one other point that I'll make is that both Dr. LaSalle and Dr. Young have agreed to be editorial fellows with School Psych Review, in addition to their guest editing this special topic section with School Psych Review. So we are super excited and tremendous gratitude to each of them as distinguished colleagues who are contributing so much. And personally, I've had the tremendous good fortune of collaborating with each of them on several of the projects that they mentioned. They're just so impressive, such great contributions. So thank you, each of you. And I'll briefly mention or introduce Dr. Dorothy Espelage. Many of you that are focused on the topics of bullying, school climate, and social emotional learning, you'd be hard pressed to not have come across great work and scholarship by Dr. Espelage. She's clearly a distinguished scholar and also a senior editor with School Psychology Review. Her present affiliation is at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Many of you know that she had spent a couple of decades as a professor at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. She always has 3 to 10 different large-scale federally funded projects that are in the works, and that is why, as Congress has been discussing various funding and supports and initiatives, that they've called upon Dr. Espelage quite frequently. But again, it happens that today she is literally sitting in hours of congressional discussion, congressional testimonies, providing information as related to these topics. I've also had the great fortune of collaborating with Dr. Espelage as well as Dr. Sue Swear on the handbook of bullying in schools, an international perspective. And you can see cutting across each of the 3 of folks who we've introduced so far, as well as myself, a strong emphasis on the topics of bullying, school climate, social emotional learning, but also considering the international or transnational context and consideration. So wanted to highlight, again, I think Dr. Espelage doesn't necessarily need much introduction, but just wanted to highlight a few of her accolades and significant, tremendously significant contributions. And again, just introducing myself in brief, presently I'm the editor-in-chief of School Psychology Review, and I'm also a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And this is an area of scholarship, as I mentioned, as I've had the good fortune of collaborating with Dr. Salle, Dr. Yang, Dr. Espelage, and many other tremendously talented colleagues across the country and throughout the world on topics related to bullying, as well as school climate, as well as social emotional learning broadly. So I'm super excited to be here today and be able to mostly learn and listen and benefit from the information that Dr. LaSalle and Dr. Yang will provide us with. And hopefully each of you will find this of great importance and be inspired a little bit, and maybe help provide some connections and an opportunity to potentially feature your work in School Psych Review in the future. Okay, so without further ado, we'll go ahead, and I think I can get us to the next one. In terms of the agenda, we can see here as outlined that we'll begin with a brief discussion of the context, highlight the importance of this topic, highlight the purpose of the special topic section. We'll note the types of manuscripts that are envisioned or hoped for, or hopefully will be inspired through your work and scholarship. We'll mention the due date. And then also at the end, we will have brief time for question and answers. And I do notice that we've already got a couple colleagues, at least one who posted a note in the question. So we'll be able to provide that. I know that we have a particular slide that features some information on that question that's been posted so far. And if you want additional information, you're always welcome to follow up and email any of us in terms of collecting additional information afterwards. Okay, so we'll go ahead and dive in, and we'll start with sharing some resources that could be helpful for students and practitioners and faculty who are out there working in different roles and responsibilities, administrators as well. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. LaSalle and Dr. Yang to share some information about resources that could be helpful for you.
So I'll start with, some resources and just talk in general about what are we referring to when we're talking about school climate, and Dr. Yang will talk a little bit more specifically about bullying and social emotional learning. So when we talk about school climate, for a long time when I was writing and when I would look up things, there was this statement that was like, there's no generally agreed upon definition of school climate, but it contains blank, blank, and blank. And those blank, blank, and blanks have been pretty consistent. So I think that we're pretty, we agree upon it at this point. In general, there are 4 broad dimensions of school climate that we're talking about: safety, teaching and learning, interpersonal relationships, and institutional environments. But those can be described in different ways, or the subscales within those can vary. And so we're talking about safety, we're talking about rules and norms, physical safety. Within the context of PBIS, for example, we're talking about, are the rules being followed consistently by students? Teaching and learning, that's support for learning. Do you feel like your teachers support you? Do you feel like that they help you in the classroom? And then when you think about interpersonal relationship, that's those peer and adult supports. And then institutional environments, the physical surroundings, and in some places, school connectedness is described there. I included under interpersonal relationships. But again, those 4 broad areas are to assess the core features of the school environment, but those subscales can vary. Like Dr. Yang said earlier, when you look at different surveys, you'll see that there are a lot of similar components to the surveys. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those resources. So how did we get here in terms of talking about school climate and evaluating school climate? Like I said before, when the No Child Left Behind waiver started, that was a big step forward. And then when Every Student Succeeds Act got passed in December 2015 under the Obama administration, that was the first time, at least on paper, that the government was saying that they're looking at factors outside of just the academic environment. And where for annual reporting measures, schools were allowed or expected to add at least one non-academic measure. For a lot of places, that's graduation. For other places, that's attendance. And for other places, that's school climate. So obviously I choose school climate because I'm biased, but we think about school climate as being really, really important because there's inherently this social and emotional component to learning. And the way that students feel about their environment, the way that they feel about their school is going to have an impact on engagement, on whether their academic futility. So one of in the study that we're doing right now, we're measuring academic futility. How well do students feel like they can do within a system? How well do they feel like the system works for them? And so it's really important when we think about school climate and we talk about it within the context of academics and the context of student achievement, is to recognize that there's this sort of reciprocal model around academics and school climate and the social emotional components and social and bullying that have an impact on student outcomes. When we think about, or when we talk about resources, one of the resources, the one guidance for measuring and using school climate data is one that I put out with some colleagues through NASP. And this document really is one of those straightforward documents about what is school climate, what are some things to consider when you're measuring it, and what is a process for using the school climate data. And that's what we really want to help pull out in this special issue is, what is the process of using school climate data intentionally to drive interventions, to support interventions, to modify interventions? So the guidance for measuring and using school climate data has that kind of information. And then another NASP resource is a framework for safe and successful schools. Again, talking about the significance of school climate. You know, we could talk about prior research looking at school climate where we see that in general, minoritized students report lower expectations of school climate than their white peers. I haven't always seen that in my research. That hasn't always been evident. And so trends change, cultures change, and it hasn't, I think that the makeup of schools also has huge implications for how students perceive the school climate when you look at teacher makeup, teacher and student ratio relative to race and ethnicity. Like Dr. Yang mentioned, when we talk about school climate, we're talking about student perceptions, teacher perceptions, and family perceptions. And really, how do you triangulate that data and use it? When school climate was first being evaluated, early school climate research, it was only looking at teacher perceptions. And while that's important, that's not the whole picture. And so we've tried to integrate student perceptions down to right now, 3rd grade level. I think Delaware is the same, 3rd grade and up, because we want to get elementary student perceptions. And we don't right now assess kindergarten and 1st and 2nd because it's not as consistent. It really depends on what happened in the prior 5 minutes for them. So we don't have those surveys, but that's definitely an important component, is looking at the triangulation of data. The other piece that I wanted to mention that someone talked about in the chat is there are a lot of school climate surveys that are already out there that have been validated. And so you don't have to feel like you have to create your own. Sometimes districts pull together questions from other surveys, but there are a lot that are out there that are freely available. I think, Shane, if you go to the next slide. There's resources. So the National Center for Safe and Supportive Learning Environments has a whole compendium of school climate surveys. And over the last few years, they've developed their own survey. But within this compendium, and that's to the question that someone else had, are these surveys where basically they reach out to different entities, and we had to go through this process of vetting the surveys, doing factor validation and content validation, and making sure that the surveys were reliable. So I encourage you to look here if you're looking for school climate surveys, because many of the surveys are freely available to use, don't cost. There are some that do, but they don't cost. And so I encourage people to look there so that you don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. I'll now let Dr. Yang kind of add on to the school climate perspective and how that relates to the social emotional and the bullying content.
Thank you, Dr. LaSalle. So in the slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition, similar to build upon the definition about school climate, the bullying, and the SEL. There's also involving development in terms of how we conceptualize SEL, as well as how do we define bullying. So many of you know this traditional, very classic definition about bullying focused on the repetitiveness, harm, and imbalanced powers are those three key characteristics of bullying. And in this special issue, and also in our ongoing work, we really embrace this more broad and inclusive definitions of bullying that is consistent with American Educational Research Association Task Force on the Prevention of Bullying in School, College, and Universities, which suggests that the bullying should be used as a more general concept surrounding victimization, perpetration, and other forms of bullying involvement that could be used interchangeably with the term of school violence and victimization. The task force also conclude that bullying is part of this larger phenomena of violence in the school and communities. So educators and scholars should not limit themselves to this traditional definition. So really encourage you to thinking about in your work, any work that beyond this traditional or more more traditional focus on the definition, really thinking about bullying as part of this phenomenon of school climate. So some of the work that looking at student victimizations or other forms of school violence that looking this phenomenon could be part of the consistent with this call. And in terms of the SEL, we know that there is also, this is very active research area that keep updating in terms of the definition. And when we conceptualize or approach or define the SEL, we're really thinking about from the social ecological perspective, thinking about SEL in a school-wide context that really define the entire school community as a unit of change, and also aim to integrate both the SEL into the daily interactions and practices at multiple settings levels in the school, use collective efforts that could including staff, families, children's. So the school-wide SEL approach really focused, emphasized not only improving students' competencies, but also simultaneously establish the caring, safe, and positive climate. So like I mentioned before, really focus on looking at both the quality instruction support of developed SEL competencies, but also thinking about the context, the conditions that those competencies could be improved and promoted. And it is also very important to establish this, provide students with opportunities to connect with others, and also thinking about the role of adults and looking at teachers or other significant adults in the development of youth or children's, what is their roles in the SEL learning and social emotional learning. And also more recently thinking about the definition of transformative SEL, really trying to understanding what are the agency, belongings, and connectedness and identity. What are those cultural sensitive, cultural relevant concept that plays role in the SEL movement. So those are some of the definitions about the three concepts. And when we are proposing this research call, we're thinking about how do we really understanding this transactional relationships among school climate, SEL, and bullying. As mentioned by Dr. LaSalle, that important of the positive climate has been well recognized in our field. And there's also very much growing research inquiries to looking at how school climate connections with SEL and bullying in psychology, education, criminology, and many other interdisciplinary fields. And one perspective really to understanding this triangle connection is that bullying is, as this most common forms of school violence, is impacted by multiple levels of school ecology, of social ecology of school. And SEL is also a structured way to improve students' social, emotional, behavioral competencies and reduce bullying under the condition of positive school climate. So we encourage you to thinking about some of the linkage among those three concepts and looking at this intersection relationships and identify the research gaps among those three areas, really trying to understanding more complete pictures of the relationships among those three factors. The next slide.
So I'll just talk about what kind of big questions are we hoping to answer through this special issue. Like Dr. Yang said, there's a long history around the positive impact of school climate. There's a long history around the positive impact of social emotional learning. And there's a long history around what kind of environments are conducive or less conducive to peer victimization behavior. But what we want to look at is how do we more intentionally examine the intersection between school climate, bullying, and social emotional learning. A lot of times we see schools doing different things and then measuring school climate, or doing different things and assessing bullying, and doing different things and saying that they're assessing social emotional learning, but it's not always with intentionality, and it's not always in a structured way. And so what we want is to encourage and invite research that is really intentional around using that data in an iterative way, so that it's driving supports, driving interventions, driving strategies that are going on within the school. That's where the evidence-based bully prevention and/or SEL programs comes in. How do we look at those programs and the perceptions on school climate? So when we talked about sort of conceptualizing the special issue, again, we see school climate as the outcome measure. And so how do these programs that are designed to create more positive environments increase student perceptions of school climate, or what conditions decrease student perceptions of school climate? So that's one of the key things, is looking at school climate as this outcome and not this kind of just secondary measure that happens to get measured, for lack of a better phrase. And then how do we advance our understanding of the relationships between the ones I talked about, school climate, bullying, and social emotional learning, among diverse cultural, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and socioeconomic populations? So as I mentioned, like my current research project is focused on collecting school climate data, quantitative data, which is what I generally collect. I think Dr. Yang and I both are used to big data sets, but extending that knowledge for me is following up with the semi-structured interviews, particularly for Black and Latinx students, to understand how does school climate work for them. And so it's more about saying this percent said that they want adult support, this percent said they want peer support. We want to know, what does that look like? And so for different students, how do we support them in a more targeted way, in a more intentional way? And how do we measure that strategically? And then finally, using a range of methodologies. And so qualitative, quantitative, mixed method approaches are all important. And we have looked at the mediating and moderating effect of school climate. And so, all that to say that we're inviting all kinds of research. We're not looking for one type. We really want this to represent a range of research methodologies. We really want this to be transnational and interdisciplinary, because again, we know that school climate can be measured in so many different ways, and there's not just one way to do that. And so how do we best represent the impact of these evidence-based programs on school climate through a range of different methods? Next slide. Dr. Yang, do you want to, is this your?
I think this is your slides.
Oh, okay, still me. The other types of, continuing with manuscripts, so efficacy trials of social emotional learning programs on K-12 settings that evaluate school climate as an outcome variable, much of what I just said. And then looking at research examining the impact of interventions focused on bullying prevention, intervention, or social emotional learning on student, teacher, and parent perceptions. And then looking at MTSS frameworks. So a couple of things I want to address here. So some people might be wondering, is school climate essential in the work for submitting for this special issue? That's one of the key things that we're looking at, right? School climate as an outcome variable. Not all programs will focus on bullying, not all will focus on social emotional learning. There might be different components there, but we do want there to be intentionality with looking at school climate, but they don't have to be school climate, bullying, and social emotional learning, right? We know what the interrelationships are, so it's not that they won't be included, but is that mandatory? No. The other piece I want to point out is when we talk about perceptions of school climate, we're interested in student, teacher, and parent or family perceptions of school climate, because they all have implications for how students experience school. And so it's not limited to just student perceptions of school climate. And for us, I think the more that we can triangulate the data, the better, but definitely looking for a range. And then when we talk about multi-tiered frameworks, PBIS or other multi-tiered frameworks that schools are using, that's a broad word, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what we're talking about when we refer to MTSS are these structured, tiered levels of support that provide universal supports for all students, and then have increasing levels of support. And so whether that be PBIS or an SEL framework, we invite people to submit. And again, we also want to acknowledge that there's not just one way to look at it, but again, being intentional about assessing to what degree do these strategies and interventions have an impact on school climate, and really in this like iterative way. So if I, for example, work a lot with schools that are implementing PBIS, and we look at the data, and just recently we looked at the data, and the two lowest areas were around peer support. Do students demonstrate behavior so that my teachers can teach and I can learn? Do I feel supported by students? And so they've been implementing this for a couple of years, and we notice that peer support continues to be one of the lower areas. And we see this consistently across grade level. We see it consistently across gender, and we saw it consistently across race and ethnicity. And so we use that data now to think about, well, what do we need to do to focus on peer relations in schools? Before, there was adult support, so they did a preferred adult survey and want to make sure that students feel connected. But how do we, within this framework, think about universally, how do we provide supports for peers? And so that's using this data on an ongoing basis. Instead of waiting till students get to tier 2 or assuming that the peer problems are only for certain students, we see this across several groups. And so that's what we mean about using the data to guide decision making, and being able to refine, modify the way that we implement these strategies. And like Dr. Yang mentioned earlier, all of our work is contextual. All of our work is culturally informed. And so when we think about refining the ways that we do things, it doesn't mean scrapping like your MTSS system, it's modifying within that system. And that's, I think, what's critical about these MTSS systems, is that there are these core features, whatever system there are these core features that you maintain, but the ways that you do it, the ways that you define expectation, the ways that you support students, the ways that you form relationships are contextually and culturally informed. And it's important to think about that when we're thinking, when we're trying to support students within schools. I was trying to see if there was something else I wanted to address. Yeah, so those are the key things there.
So this slides we talk a little, I want to just add a little bit about other types of manuscript beyond the intervention focus, looking at efficacy trial type of research. You're also very encouraging transnational research, like Dr. LaSalle mentioned before, that we know this our school population in the US has been increasingly diverse right now. And then to understanding the translational work is very important for us to help develop this culturally sensitive instruments, either school climate measures or any other type of instrument, as well as interventions to promote the positive climate and youth development among diverse learners in the US school context. And also this transnational investigation could inform us about the structural similarities and differences across different school contexts and educational systems, which serve as the space for adapting effective school-based strategies from one context to another. It could be one country to another. We know that a lot of effective interventions are also developed around the world. So when we are trying to introduce those type of intervention in the US context, we need to understanding the underlying similarities and differences of the context, what condition that works for that type of intervention. So to understanding the cultural variation could help us to smooth this introduction. And also thinking about another type of manuscript we're very hoping to look into is the focus on students with minoritized background, marginalized background. It could be the racial ethnic background, disability, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic language, other type of or educational system. Because when we're thinking about students with minoritized or marginalized background, those are the students facing the highest risk of bullying. And they're also experiencing much larger barriers in terms of structural barriers, social, ecological, social language barriers for receiving quality and equitable social emotional behavior support. So to promote the studies that understand the impact of evidence-based bullying and SEL interventions that can help us to create this equitable outcome for minoritized students. And also to understand the differential impact for the school-based interventions among different populations, because that is the place to reduce those structural barriers and promote youth development. So that's the next.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, to what you were saying, Dr. Yang. Just to piggyback off of what Dr. Yang was saying relative to minoritized and marginalized groups, we really encourage manuscripts that focus on a strengths-based perspective when talking about minoritized and marginalized groups. So what kinds of resources do they have, and how do we use that to create more positive and affirming environments, and not thinking about different as a deficit? And so definitely focusing on a strengths-based perspective, and also like centering the experiences of the students or the groups that you intend to study, or the groups that you intend to include in your research. Because I think that it's sometimes we get so focused on comparing marginalized and minoritized students to majority, whatever that looks like, students without disabilities, students who are cisgender, and we then lose the narrative of the group that we were focusing on initially. And so really focusing on, again, the strengths-based perspective and centering the experiences of students, and trying to think about how do we improve their school experience, and use the resources that we have in schools, use resources we have from their families, resources that they bring to school, to create positive and affirming environments.
Next slide. Yeah, in terms of the methodology, we know that when we're thinking about the transactional relationship among those three areas, it's very complex. So we really encourage, it's really hard to tackle this complexities just relied on one specific methods or approach. So we're really encouraging a multi-methodological approach. Understanding could be when we're looking at existing research, either published in SPR or any other school psych journals, we see a lot of study that focused on large population, like this large scale, either survey study, correlation, observational study. So we're still encouraging that type of analysis, but we're also looking for some of the longitudinal design to really thinking about the fundamental changes in this dynamics, and also thinking about intervention, the long-term impact of some of the school-based intervention on school climate or social emotional competency. And an intervention study, like Dr. LaSalle mentioned, that this is an area that could really help us to thinking about what are some of the malleable factors that could inform the intervention, and also what the effectiveness of the intervention, particularly for marginalized minoritized population. And scale development, what are some, especially thinking about the transnational context, and also how those culturally sensitive scales or measures that could apply to different diverse groups, and that could be some of the areas looking at the scale development. And also qualitative research and mixed methods. I think when we're looking at published studies in this area, this is the area that still we have a lot of the space to grow, and really thinking about how do we use different types of method, qualitative approach to help us to understand the voice of minoritized populations, their experience school climate perceptions, or their experiences with bullying, as well as the barriers or challenges or some of the strengths when they are trying to approach or receiving or seeking support for social emotional learning. So we're looking forward some of the qualitative and thinking about the mixed methods that integrate the qualitative and quantitative approach. Anything else that Dr. LaSalle want to add?
No.
Next slides. So this slide just shows some of the recent related articles that have been published in SPR. And when we are looking at the existing studies, very interesting to see that the majority studies has been centered around like each of the topic. So that was one of the motivation for us to really thinking about the connections among those three areas. And we see some study has been started looking at like participatory research, looking at student school climate experiences, and also intervention studies and connecting SEL and bullying. But still, when we're thinking about the context of school climate, how that interact with SEL and to inform bullying intervention or promote school climate, we were looking forward those studies that connecting this three area, and or at least two or three areas that could help us to understanding the complexity or intersection among those three. So those are some studies. And then there are also, we know that this three area is not really the specialized area for school psychology. So when you're looking at demental psychology, looking at school violence research and criminology, we also see a lot of research that are developing related to areas. So we encourage you to embrace this interdisciplinary perspective. How do we solve those issues and advance our understanding from different disciplinary perspective.
Excellent. And as Dr. Young had shared and highlighted there, that there's a clear emphasis on the tremendous insights and information that we can benefit from interdisciplinary colleagues. And again, Dr. Espelage not able to join us today due to her other responsibilities, but she is among the guest editors, and clearly she comes from a strong emphasis on counseling psychology, but looking at those intersects with school psychology and education and the application of our knowledge as related to victimization, bullying, school climate, and social emotional learning broadly. So we do want to certainly highlight the contributions that our allied professionals, scholars, and others can make, and we certainly encourage contributions to the special topics section and to SPR in general. And as noted in the various materials that have been distributed and at the beginning of our session today, the due date for submitting papers specifically for consideration for this special topic section is July 20th. So again, we're only here in May right now, so you have a few more months to wrap up those papers and prepare them for submission. And again, if your particular project doesn't avail itself or is not prepared by July 20th, we certainly welcome further submissions in the future on this topic. It just might be that it wouldn't be able to be slotted into the special topics section if suitable for publication. But certainly we intend to continue to feature articles in School Psychology Review that address school climate, that address the bullying, as well as the social emotional learning. And you can submit the articles as well as find out more information for authors online through the Taylor and Francis School Psych Review website. This is what it will look like if you click on it there. And you'll see that there's an opportunity for to review the instructions for authors, to give you a sense of the format and provide general guidance. A couple of things just to mention are that, one, as noted, all of the papers that are submitted to the special topics section and general articles to the journal, all papers go through a triple blind peer review process. Triple blind refers to the fact that the authors do not know who the reviewers are. The reviewers do not know who the authors are. And the action editors also do not know who the authors are. So ultimately, myself as the editor-in-chief, I have access to know all of those individuals, but when a decision is made, it's made by an action editor who has processed that paper and managed the paper through this triple blind peer review process in order to maximize fairness and really aim to minimize bias of any sort through that process. So we want to highlight that all papers, this is an open call for papers. Everyone has an opportunity to contribute. And particularly in this instance, as Dr. LaSalle, Dr. Young, and Dr. Espelage have outlined in the call for papers, there's a strong emphasis on transnational contributions, transdisciplinary contributions, scholarship that cuts across multiple areas to really advance our knowledge as related to school climate, bullying, and social emotional learning. So you can find more information out there. The only other thing I would highlight is that we do have a prompt turnaround. Our commitment is to preparing high quality and timely decisions and feedback for authors. And by high quality, we emphasize providing thoughtful, constructive, kind reviews, both from our editorial board members as well as the action editors. And in terms of timely, we're committed to providing decisions within 30 days from submission to decision. There are instances where it does take a little bit longer depending upon the availability of reviewers and/or the events that are happening in the world. But generally speaking, we do have decisions within those 30 days. And on average, across the past year, it's been about 20 days on average, right? So that's another thing that some authors might be interested in considering as related to submitting or preparing their paper and possibly submitting their paper to a school psych review. Through the guest editors, Dr. LaSalle, Dr. Young, and Dr. Espelage would be the managing action editors on the papers that are submitted. And we have a very large, robust editorial board who would be involved with reviewing the papers as reviewers, as well as a student editorial board that also makes significant contributions to the process. So if all of that sounds of interest, we welcome your submissions to this special topics section. Okay, and then I think we preserved just a few minutes here for questions and perhaps some answers. I had put into the chat that there would be this opportunity. I know that Achilles Bardos from Greece, so great to shout out to our colleagues in Greece who is on. We did share a resource that provides information about the compendium that Dr. LaSalle had mentioned. So if there's other questions, we're happy to share additional resources or respond to your questions in particular. Just post it either in the Q&A, which you can see along the Zoom menu there, or you can go ahead and post in chat. And I'll also open it up to Dr. LaSalle and Dr. Young at this point, if they might have had additional thoughts, things that have come to mind that they would want to share as we're seeing whether or not there are any questions from our participants today.
The only thing that I'll reiterate again is that we added the resources for school climate surveys. Again, that list is not exhaustive, so there are other ones out there. We're not saying that those are the only ones that are out there. And when we talk about evidence-based programs, there's room for exploration in the papers that are submitted. So we know that there are some well-established programs out there. There are some that are in the process, and invite manuscripts that explore both options or both kinds of research phases, I guess.
Excellent. Any other thoughts or reflections, Dr. Young?
Yeah, I was thinking about in terms of the transnational research, a lot of times I'm thinking of some of the SEL research, for example, in China, and maybe the term that they might not call it SEL, but it does looking at some of the core SEL competencies. So I'm thinking about, we encourage the authors trying to thinking about what other this very culturally specific or linguistic specific context of those construct doesn't have to be like specific to when we talk thinking about bullying or SEL has to be the specific the terms, but the latent construct or when people conceptualize those issues or similar, that could fit into the special issue. Because like in the Chinese context, a lot of study looking at like suzhi, which is part of this SEL movement, but it's not called SEL. So I think it could happen in many other countries or contexts, thinking about what are the culturally specific terms.
Excellent, thank you. Fantastic. Well, we're just about out of time here today. And Dr. LaSalle, did I see your hand was up, or were you just waving?
No, I don't need, no, it's not up.
Okay. And so thank you for joining us throughout the world, across the nation. Great to have so many participants with us here today. This recording will be posted on the School Psych Review YouTube channel. And we also welcome further outreach and communications with Dr. LaSalle, Dr. Young, and Dr. Espelage, as well as myself. We're super enthusiastic to continue to engage and communicate and collaborate and learn from our colleagues throughout the world, and this tremendous emphasis on the transdisciplinary and transnational science that can inform and advance positive youth outcomes. Tremendously important. Again, grateful for the previous contributions, ongoing contributions, and upcoming contributions of our distinguished colleagues, Dr. LaSalle, Dr. Yang, and Dr. Espelage. And we wish each of you the best, and please be in touch with us if you have any further questions or comments, or we look forward to also seeing your papers being submitted to School Psych Review. So take care and have a great day. Thank you.